We started this series because of the killing of George Floyd and the conversations that followed. What we saw, and what many of you noticed too, were some deeply uncomfortable public debates and, in some cases, outright racist attacks against black people, especially in America. We wanted to actually look at the claims being made and test whether they were true. So, at the start of this series, we defined some terms. We looked at racism, white supremacy, black supremacy, and so on. In the next video, we looked directly at white supremacy versus black supremacy. Are they really the same thing? After that, we dove into the deaths of George Floyd and Charlie Kirk, asking whether the events themselves were similar, whether the public's responses were the same, and what those reactions said about us. Now, in this video, we're taking a closer look at the Black Lives Matter movement and the subsequent backlash and counter movements that followed. We're asking, is Black Lives Matter a racist organization? Was it founded in a spirit of black supremacy or something else? When people responded with white lives matter or all lives matter, are those reasonable responses, or are they just more ways to sidestep or drown out the conversation? Let us get into it. Black Lives Matter began in the United States of America in July of 2013 after a Florida jury acquitted neighborhood watch volunteer George Zimmerman of murdering Trayvon Martin, an unarmed black teenager. 3 black community organizers, Alicia Garza, Patrice Collins, and Opal Tometi, used the hashtag Black Lives Matter on social media to build a movement to challenge what they saw as systemic and state-sanctioned violence against black people. The Black Lives Matter Global Network Foundation states that it seeks to abolish white supremacy and end violence inflicted on black communities by police and vigilantes. BLM is a decentralized network, so it's not like one of those big organizations. They are more kind of like local chapters that operate independently and share broad goals of racial justice. Now, this is what BLM is saying about itself, not my personal opinion about the movement. The immediate motivation for BLM was deep frustration with police brutality. The founders said black people are disproportionately killed by police and that courts rarely hold officers or vigilantes accountable. They chose the phrase Black Lives Matter to highlight their belief that society does not value black lives equally and to call for fair treatment under the law. Contrary to claims that BLM demands special rights, activists explain that by saying Black Lives Matter does not mean other lives don't matter. It really is about drawing attention to a specific problem that black people, especially those in America, are facing. Black Lives Matter quickly moved from social media to street protests, especially after high-profile killings like Michael Brown in Ferguson in 2014, Eric Garner in New York also in 2014, and Sandra Bland in Texas in 2015. According to data from the Armed Conflict Location and Event Data Project, ACLED, after George Floyd was killed by police officer Derek Chauvin in 2020, BLM protests became one of the largest protest movements in US history. In just a few weeks, there were over 8,700 BLM-related demonstrations across 74 countries, including the United States of America. In America, these protests included marches, speeches, sit-ins, and economic boycotts. Most were peaceful, but some led to property damage or clashes with police. At first, most Americans, including many white Americans, said they supported BLM's goals, but over time, opinions began to kind of splinter off. Some conservative politicians and media started calling the movement anti-police, and they accused BLM of encouraging destruction or even pushing black supremacy. BLM leaders pushed back, saying most violence came from people that were not connected to the movement at all, and that police actions, rather than the protests themselves, usually cause those things to escalate. Now, we can take a minute to determine if these protests are actually violent and BLM is just blaming the other side, or if something more sinister could have happened at the time. Now, I'm not saying that I have proof that something untoward happened, but history actually gives us some reasons to treat these claims seriously. There are well-documented cases going back decades where government agencies or law enforcement have inserted undercover officers, informants, or so-called agent provocateurs into protest crowds. For example, the FBI's COINTELPRO program was specifically created to infiltrate and disrupt civil rights groups in the 1960s and 70s. Further afield in the UK, undercover police have been caught trying to undermine black justice campaigns. And even today, it is standard practice in many big city police departments to deploy plainclothes officers in protest settings, sometimes for surveillance and sometimes to catch or even provoke lawbreaking. There have also been credible accusations, even though these are not well documented, about outside agitators or unaffiliated bad actors deliberately turning peaceful demonstrations into violent ones, sometimes for their own political ends. Add to that the real tension, confusion, and sometimes aggressive crowd control tactics by police, and you have a recipe where it can be genuinely hard to know who threw the first stone or who turned a protest into a riot. The point is, it's not crazy to suggest that violence sometimes comes from outside the core of a movement, or that heavy-handed police action itself can turn a tense but peaceful protest into something much worse. This is a basic fact that is supported by decades of protest history, and I thought that this was a critical piece of context that you needed to know before you start pointing fingers. Some BLM leaders, this is that most violence didn't come from BLM protests, and that escalation was often a response to aggressive policing or infiltration. There is actually historical precedent to back up that claim. So we have to remember there are multiple factors and contexts to consider when we are assessing a situation, especially something that is extremely divisive. This wasn't just an American story. Around the world, people saw what was happening and poured into the streets in solidarity. In cities outside the US, these protests often drew tens of thousands of people. According to ACLED, many demonstrators abroad focused their outrage on American symbols like US embassies, consulates, and Trump properties, but they also connected the movement to their own struggles with police brutality and racism. In London, protesters brought up the death of Mark Dugan. In France, they spoke the name of Abna Traore. In Brazil, people rallied for João Pedro. In fact, in many places, Black Lives Matter became a kind of shorthand or brand for anti-police violence activism in general. It inspired protests against the deaths of indigenous peoples who were in the custody of Australian police. It decried caste-based violence in India and pushed back against Islamophobia across Europe. The sheer scale and reach of these protests are clear evidence that this wasn't just about George Floyd or the death of one black man at the hands of police. People were speaking out about their own experiences with systemic racism and heavy-handed policing wherever they lived. But as Black Lives Matter grew, there was also backlash. That's when we started to see White Lives Matter pop up, especially around 2015. According to the Southern Poverty Law Center, it was created as a direct response to BLM, and it's been picked up mostly by neo-Nazi and white supremacist groups. Their rallies, like the one in Houston, have included people carrying weapons and even anti-Semitic signs. Big surprise, right? Civil rights groups call White Lives Matter a hate movement, and well, the organizers themselves say they are protecting the white race, I guess from black people, right? And they use a lot of white supremacist symbols and language. Now, people in these groups claim that white Americans are somehow facing a genocide. They are afraid that the white race will either go extinct or become a minority due to immigration or interracial marriage. Unfortunately, this is one of the biggest reasons behind the systemic and systematic oppression of black people in America. Now, let's define genocide. It is the deliberate and systematic killing or prosecution of a large number of people from a particular national or ethnic group with the aim of destroying them. There is absolutely no organized effort and certainly no campaign by black people or anyone else to wipe out white Americans. But when fear and prejudice takes over, I suppose facts become irrelevant. So there's that. But if it was just stupid people thinking stupid things, we could just leave it at that. However, there are real consequences when white rage comes to a boil. White genocide has been used by white supremacist groups as a rallying cry, and for some, as justification for violence against black people and other minorities. For example, when Kyle Rittenhouse killed 2 people at a protest, some White Lives Matter supporters praised him, holding him up as a defender of their cause. This is where the tactics of modern white supremacy become more insidious. It's not always white hoods and burning crosses. Sometimes it's black faces delivering the message. Scholars of race and propaganda call this racial laundering, the process by which fringe or extremist ideas are mainstreamed through spokespeople who, at first glance, seem to undermine the charge of racism by their very identity. In October 2022, Kanye West showed up at a fashion show wearing a shirt that said White Lives Matter, and right beside him, there was Candace Owens in the same shirt. Naturally, people were shocked and horrified because they were publicly aligning themselves with a reactionary white supremacist slogan. Candace Owens has publicly used All Lives Matter in speeches and broadcasts. She claims that this is not rooted in systemic racism and insists the association with racism is something invented by BLM to divide people. Because Candace Owens and Kanye West have large platforms and a lot of people listen to them, when they use the slogan, it brings that language into the mainstream and essentially moves what political scientists call the Overton window, which is just the range of what's considered normal or acceptable to say about race in America. Suddenly, what used to be a fringe talking point is on cable news, in political debates, and showing up in everyday conversations. These racial ventriloquists help sanitize the message. When public figures like Kanye West and Candace Owens put on White Lives Matter shirts or publicly repeat slogans that have a clear history in white supremacy circles, this is a covert strategy to launder white supremacist ideologies using black faces, making the message look less like hate and more like just another opinion. They are serving a very specific function in a larger system. I'm going to over-explain here for a bit, but I really need you to understand what these people are doing. So imagine you wanted to sell something toxic, but people would reject it, right? If it came from you directly. So instead you find someone or, who people trust, who people look to, or maybe somebody who look like them that can convince them, and you get that person to sell it for you. That is basically what is happening here. White supremacist talking points and slogans that would immediately get backlash if they came from, say, a KKK member suddenly become reasonable debate topics when they come out of the mouths of prominent black conservatives. The genius of this strategy is that it gives white people who already hold these views permission to express them openly. They can point to Candace or Kanye West and say, see, I am not a racist because black people are saying the same thing. This can disarm critics and confuse the public, creating the illusion of honest debate where in reality a harmful narrative is being laundered through trusted or recognizable black figures. When people who look like the oppressed target of racism start defending or downplaying that racism, it makes it harder to call out it for what it is. It sort of muddies the waters. Now, don't get me wrong, this is not really about whether or not Candace Owens or Kanye West actually believe the nonsense that is coming out of their mouths. Maybe they do, maybe they don't. What matters is the function they serve in this system. They are what some scholars call racial ventriloquists. Black voices speaking white supremacist talking points. The ventriloquist metaphor is apt because just like a ventriloquist makes it seem like the dummy is actually talking on its own, this system makes it appear as though these ideas arise naturally from black conservative thought, when in reality they are often recycled talking points that serve white supremacist agendas. The reason this matters so much is because of how powerful representation is. When people see someone who looks like them, or someone from a community they respect endorsing certain ideas, those ideas carry more weight. This is basic human psychology. We trust people we identify with more than we trust outsiders. So when black public figures promote narratives that harm black communities, it creates confusion and provides cover for systems that maintain racial inequality. The real damage happens in how this shifts public conversation. Issues that should be straightforward, like acknowledging that black lives are undervalued in American society, become controversial. Topics that we have to hear both sides on. Police violence against black people becomes something we debate instead of something that we address. They claim that systemic racism does not exist, and they blame black people for adopting a victimhood mentality. This strategy is particularly effective because it exploits our desire to be fair and to hear different perspectives. Nobody wants to be accused of silencing black voices. So when black ventriloquists like Candace Owens and Kanye West promote white supremacist ideologies, even people who might otherwise be skeptical feel obligated to take them seriously. The result is that harmful ideas get mainstream platforms they never would have gotten otherwise. No, I'm not saying that we should dismiss all black conservative voices or assume that they're all puppets of white supremacists. What I am saying is that we must be aware of how systemic racism adapts and evolves. It has become more insidious. So KKK people are not out here in the streets wearing white sheets and burning crosses anymore. Sometimes it is a black woman in her basement telling you she's a Catholic and that Christ is king, while also explaining to you why racism does not exist in America anymore. This does not mean that you should now go and attack Candace Owens. I am not saying that by any means, right? Or Kanye West for that matter. What it means is that you must keep a watchful eye for how these patterns of white supremacy show up in society so that you can understand how these systems of oppression use whatever tools that are available to maintain themselves, including voices from the very communities they harm. And that brings us to the big question. Is Black Lives Matter a racist movement? Is it really about black supremacy, or is that just another smokescreen to keep people distracted from the real issue? After everything that we have unpacked in this video, it should be clear that these accusations don't really hold any water. BLM was never about flipping the power dynamic or putting black people, on top. Most black folks just want to be treated fairly or to be left alone, to be honest. What BLM has always wanted is to break this cycle of violence, pull back the curtain on systems that have held people down for generations, and demand equal treatment under the law. That's it. The goal was always and has always been justice, accountability, and a society where black lives are valued, really valued, just like everyone else's. Now, when you hear slogans like white lives matter or all lives matter, you have to recognize where that is coming from. These slogans aren't really about pride or unity, to be honest. They are about fear. But it is a very specific, ancient fear that runs deep in white America that most people carrying it around don't even realize that it is there. White people are afraid that if things ever really changed, if black people ever had real power in America, they would do to white people exactly what was done to them. That's really the problem. It is the terror of imagining your children in chains, your family torn apart at auction blocks, your humanity denied for centuries. It is the nightmare of being seen as less than human, of being brutalized with the same casual cruelty that white America once perfected. This fear lives in the bones of white supremacy. It's why equality feels like oppression to some white people. It's why black success feels like white failure. It's why a black president, or black people saying their lives matter, or black people asking to be treated fairly feels like an existential threat. This fear reveals that deep down, white people know what they did to black people was evil. They know slavery and segregation and lynching and redlining were unforgivable sins, and they're terrified that black people are just as capable of those same monstrosities. What they can't see, what the fear blinds them to, is that black people are not be like that. After centuries of the worst treatment imaginable, black people didn't respond by trying to enslave white children. We responded by asking to be seen as human beings. We responded by demanding equality. We never sought revenge. The tragedy is that these white fear prevents them from seeing black people as who we really are. Just people who want the same basic things that everyone wants. Safety, opportunity, dignity, and love for our children. Instead, they see black people as future oppressors who must be kept in check, rather than fellow human beings who have been asking for justice all along. That's what makes these slogans so insidious. They serve as a protective barrier, allowing white people to avoid the reckoning with their history, while keeping alive the fear that black people might one day seek the same kind of brutal payback that haunts their collective memory. And all lives matter? Well, it sounds harmless. It just shows up to drown out or sideline the urgent calls for justice that Black Lives Matter is really putting on the table. It takes the spotlight off the real problem and pushes it back on the status quo. Now, I must point out that because Black Lives Matter operates as a decentralized movement, this creates vulnerabilities. Bad actors can infiltrate local chapters or stage provocative actions designed to discredit the broader movement. We already touched on this a little earlier in this video when I explained how federal agencies have a documented history of infiltrating Black liberation movements through programs like COINTELPRO. So the same thing could have happened with BLM, and as a matter of fact, white supremacist groups have openly discussed these topics online.
Officials in Minnesota and Pennsylvania have also said they believe that white supremacists may be among those trying to infiltrate Black Lives Matter events. Southern Poverty Law Center, which tracks hate group and extremist activity, tells us their intel found people associated with far-right and neo-Confederate groups are in fact participating in Bay Area protests.
It's important to understand that this is what they do, that they capitalize on political chaos and seek to sow further chaos.
Law enforcement officials believe that extremist organizations have infiltrated the protest, intent on stirring up trouble. Investigators are pointing to white supremacist organizations.
We're going to start releasing who some of these people are, and they'll be able to start tracing that history of where they're at and what they're doing on the dark web and how they're organizing. But I'm not trying to say that. I think our best estimate right now that I heard is about 20% is what we think are Minnesotans, and about 80% are outside.
We've learned that Denver police seized weapons and tactical gear from two men who came to Friday's protest. One of them is connected to a far-right extremist group that is preparing for a coming civil war in America.
This is what officers say they seized from them. 3 assault rifles, handguns, and other tactical equipment like gas masks, vests, numerous magazines, and ammunition.
We're ready for rock and roll.
McGee identifies with the so-called Boogaloo movement, a group who says it's preparing for a civil and race war.
Even before this weekend's protest began, some of Charlotte's local activists were raising questions about who was behind them and why.
I had clicked on the Facebook event post that I was interested in the march.
B. Cote was gearing up to attend Friday night's protest when a friend in city government warned her that she might want to reconsider.
She cautioned me that this was not being put on by anybody locally that she knew. So then I started reaching out to my friends who are activists, and turns out nobody knew this organization.
By then, information was circulating on social media here that the protests were quietly being organized by white supremacist groups to widen the racial divide.
I knew that it was not copacetic, and so I chose not to go. I reached out to some other organizers and told them this was some kind of outside entity.
According to court documents, the 3 men were determined to incite violence, which included a plan to burn police with Molotov cocktails during a Black Lives Matter protest that happened Saturday in downtown Las Vegas. They're accused of being part of an anti-government extremist group known as the Boogaloo movement. The court documents also indicate the men infiltrated at least 2 Black Lives Matter protests right here in the Valley and were encouraging protesters to get violent. Federal authorities say along with the Molotov cocktails, they also seized an AR-15 rifle, a shotgun, as well as ammunition.
They commit acts of vandalism. They know that any violence at a BLM protest will be blamed on black activists, right? Regardless of who actually committed the act. The strategy works because most people only see the headlines and the footage of burning buildings. Social media amplifies this manipulation. Accounts with anonymous profiles spread videos of violence at protests while claiming they show BLM rioters. Many of these accounts turn out to be operated by white supremacist groups or foreign actors trying to destabilize American society. They flood platforms with carefully edited clips that remove context and minimize outrage. So we have to be very careful as we move along the internet space so that we are not being programmed.